Put your hands together.
Hey. All right. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. Just double check by show of thumbs. People can hear me. Show of thumbs. Awesome. All right. So this is Common Mistakes by New Game Developers version 3.0. Admittedly, parts of this presentation are kind of stapled together from others because there was too much I wanted to cover. We'll try to get through it, and hopefully we get unreasonable time for some questions. My background includes sort of what I call a sampler platter in industry. I got some time in AAA industry and startup world, indie mobile scene, academia as well. Released over 100 games. The vast majority of those were recreational or educational projects, but maybe about 15, 20 of them commercial, and that's been spread out over the past 20 years. My business experience includes starting 2 companies without any outside funding, 5 published game deals, including a top 2 paid app, my digital books in over 200,000 people's hands, 4th hire at a company that became popular up San Francisco, network like it's my job, because it kind of is, conference speaker a bunch, and do a lot of content marketing, which is just business speak for podcasts, YouTube videos, articles, all that kind of stuff. So the reason this is Talk 3.0 is that things keep changing, and points that used to be important for me to bring up in version 1.0 in 2015 have since changed, and then again version 2.0, and then the things that either kind of become common sense that used to not be, or vice versa, or just the market changes underneath us. One of the things about game development in general is that it's constantly evolving, and so you kind of got to be ready for knowledge from even a few years ago to be pretty quickly obsoleted. Now, I will say that even though it's not those talks, I do borrow a few slides from them. If you're interested in the actual longer form of them, both versions of those previous talks are on my GameKeto YouTube channel. Might involve a bit of digging, but it's the same talk title. The reason this talk is needed at all is, and this is something that's kind of a very personal thing for me, I've met a lot of game developers who burned through 4 or 5 digits of their savings or through debt, and out of that, built a project or two that earned them back hundreds of dollars out of that money spent. They then quit game development forever, which makes me sad, because game development is awesome and great and should be wonderful and can be a lifelong thing, but if approached the wrong way, it does not wind up being so. Or, on the other side, people who go the studio path, I've met people who've spent similar amounts of money, or years on a credential, wound up in industry, got disillusioned by it within a few years, and once again, pivoted out of game development, which is such a shame when making games, once again, is awesome and doesn't have to be like that. There's lots of warning articles, and these are increasingly common. Klifsky's blog, by the way, is excellent, the Positech guy. If you haven't checked out this article, it's kind of worth being aware of. It just has to deal with the difficulties of the market financially, and some more recent high-profile examples. Lots of very personal stories as well. Tumbleseed's challenges in terms of a lot of people expect it to be a big smash hit. Kind of wasn't. Aztez, likewise. I've been following those guys now, friends of mine, for probably 5-7 years of working on that game, and it is just not return on their investment in any sort of reasonable time frame. But the talk is not to say you shouldn't be doing game development. This is not a Chicken Little talk. This is not a dreaded warning talk. My assumption here is you're going to make games, so let's talk about how to improve the odds and or considerations into when we pick a path and how we might steer through it, what kind of things we might avoid, just so we kind of go into it a little more ready. There's this great quote, Chris Crawford, one of the inspirations for me. He's a guy who founded Game Developers Conference out of his basement. But he said, we have pretty much passed the period where hobbyists can put together a game that would have commercial prospect. It's much more difficult to break in, much less stay in. If you want to do a game, do it for fun, but don't try to do game designs to make any money. The odds are so much against any individual, he would hate to wish that heartbreak on anyone. And the reason this quote is great is because he made it in February 1985, which clearly there have been many time periods since, several bubbles since, when hobbyists, in fact, did put together games of immediate commercial prospect and significance. Those times and the challenges come and go. It's cyclical. We're not the first time in or out of any of this, but it helps kind of give these hints to, even then, we had these kind of Chicken Little stories back then. Another kind of context this comes from when I say it's 3.0 is Rami and Lisa Brown and some other folks gave a fine GDC panel, I don't remember if it was last year or the year before, in which they basically corrected advice they'd given at previous GDCs. They'd given presentations that in hindsight, after they'd seen people follow through on their advice, or learned some other information, or just again, the industry changed underneath them, they realized it was kind of like not just wrong, but dangerously wrong in terms of leading people kind of lemmings off a cliff. Now, I will say, to me, there's a big asterisk next to the all advice is bad. This is coming from a case where at GDC, a lot of the speakers are kind of speaking from their own experience, and that's part of why it's bad advice. The cause of bad advice is pretty easy to understand when you kind of take a step back and look at it. Usually, it's one person's anecdote or hindsight theory, which is to say, you know, it worked for them. Will it work for somebody else at a different time? Who's to say? We don't know, because it's usually not been shown to work consistently for others. It hasn't actually been applied as a template. Or if it has, we don't really hear those stories. That means it also hasn't been refined through having applied it again and again, make tweaks to it and improvements to it. It kind of stays a theory. Inexperienced people tend to be extra confident. This is true for people writing blog articles, making YouTube videos, etc. People who have little experience in actually releasing a game will often be the most confident about their theories, which doesn't serve us well when people are trying to figure out who to listen to. And the other part is just kind of people want the advice for free, which means it isn't tailored to a person's background or goals, which is fine, but it is to recognize that then the onus becomes on the person to figure out, does this actually map for where you're trying to get or where you're coming from? Because that's part of why advice can wind up bad. It's just applied to someone who's not trying to get where that advice would take them. Now, where I'm coming from is a little bit different on this stuff, and why I feel like I'm quite qualified to be dispensing advice. I'm frequently interviewing other developers. This is not just based on me or my own personal background story through the podcast, or my club guest speakers, through arranging talks for conferences. I work with lots of other developers to keep a thumb on what's happening in different spaces, what are changes going on, and so on. I've been at GDC since 2005, organized all the speakers, or co-organized them rather, for 5 different indiecades. Hundreds of people have gone through my clubs, now 3 clubs, worked with dozens of people privately for years, which is also to say quite literally, I make my living being paid for my advice. For better or for worse, that's what I am in the trade of doing, and to the degree that I'm wrong about it, it comes back to bite me and hurts me directly financially, and that's what I improve at. Nearly 100,000 people have taken my video course, which is to say we've been able to take parts of this, bubble it out, take it out to scale. But, you know, information today will address role of context. So I'm not assuming you're all going the same way or coming from the same background. I'll be throughout identifying if you want to go this way or that way. Here's how or why that consideration might come up into play in a different way. Alumni from 2 college clubs that I established back in 2004, then 2010, went on to work at a bunch of different game companies. Even though, again, commercial studio work is not necessarily everybody's goal. Some of these other folks also helped start companies together, including Golden Glitch was alumni from one of the clubs, as well as Stork Burnt Down and Turbo Button, or at least half in that case. Now, I like to start with an easy one. This is one that I don't think anybody necessarily has to hear, but maybe we start kind of one we're all kind of on the same page on, is that arguing about games is not game design. When we're arguing about how a game should have been done differently or how we would have done it or whatever, I don't think that's actually that fruitful because it's so divorced from the details of the context of the challenges faced from production, what the trade-offs are, and so on. So unless you're arguing about your game with your team, it's just not that fruitful of an exercise. It just kind of eats up a lot of our life. I'm a partial to a lot of Stoic philosophy. Marcus Aurelius is one of my favorite writers and one of my favorite people. And I like his quote that waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one. And part of what I love about game development is it's a field that's accessible enough where rather than arguing about what makes a good game, there's a chance for however many of us want to throw our hat in the ring to try showing our answer to here's what we think a good game is. And I think the conversation's moved forward a lot better by people making what they believe is a good game than anybody saying how they think some other game should have been done differently. Now, even though everybody can make games, making games at all, to say the process of being a game developer, is not really the same as making games to a professional degree. And this is true for so many other fields, game development being a little bit more of a green one than, you know, painting or writing or whatever. It tends to not maybe show up the same to us. But I want to put a huge slap you right disclaimer on this. I am super not opposed to hobby game development. I'm just super opposed to hobby game development getting confused with not hobby game development. I wrote the Hobby Game Dev blog for 6 years. When I wrote a few episodes for extra credits, one of my first episodes I wrote was literally about hobby game development, how great it is, and how wonderful it is. So I'm not opposed to it, but it is a case of it's a very different sort of ballast and how it fits into our life. Now, there's different career paths we might take, whether we're looking at indie or studio, and they have different trade-offs involved. Either one, though, is still different from hobby, even though hobby might grow into either direction. Part of why I bring these up is that when people talk about, again, with advice about the importance of credentials or networking or otherwise, and attitudes about game development, some of those fit very closely into the bin of if you're going studio track, absolutely applies. If you're going indie developer solo or a small team, absolutely does not. These include things like whether or not you want to try to be kind of a generalist in your skills or whether or not you're trying to be deeply specialized. Obviously, career track, deeply specialized. Indie developer track, you're going to have to wear more hats no matter how small the company is or how big the company is. That's kind of the nature of those. The other part is that these aren't as mutually exclusive as they sometimes sound. It sometimes feels like there's a fork in the road, you got to go one or the other. Lots of people weave back and forth or maybe crash back and forth between these. Lots of people, of course, try to use indie development as a bit of a stepping stone towards studio careers, and vice versa. A lot of the indie developers I've seen who've been able to survive economic challenges actually are ex-studio people who quit together and started indie studios together, having then gotten to the habits of doing 40-plus hour work weeks on game development, which is kind of a different rhythm to go into it with. And there's kind of, we can maybe attack more of those differences in the questions if people have specific questions, but I think a lot of these are going to hit in the slides ahead. And think about the pathways. By the way, the slides aren't all this wordy, just these first ones are. Some major considerations come down to obviously how well it pays, but with what certainty. In that part, I think I don't have to go any deeper on, like, of course, that's a consideration, but also the level of choice in what you make and how. When EA Visceral Games recently shut down, very recently, there was a quote from an anonymous developer on the team who said, like, people think it sounds like it'd be awesome to work on a Star Wars game. The reality was it was really frustrating. Because on the one hand, yeah, everyone knows what Star Wars is. The other hand is, like, they had to get everyone's permission constantly with, like, months of response wait time on, can we include this weapon? Is this how this character can look? And so there's these trade-offs that we make, and this goes across the board, not necessarily up to Star Wars scale, but at any level of professional grade or reach. The bigger company you're at, the more barriers you have to fight through to get your say in something, and the smaller company you're at, the more say you have in it, even if it means you're not getting, obviously, paid as well or as reliably from it. Value of experience or credit you gain from it. This is something that has to not be ignored. Lots of people pay attention to this while they're in college and thinking about which classes they're taking, how it's going to look on their resume or CV applying for positions or trying to find collaborators. The same thing's true for every game you're going to work on throughout your entire life. Whether it's a hobby project, whether it is a small studio project, big studio project, whatever. These are things that are going to affect your future work based on how it does or doesn't relate to things you've done before. And that's something we start to sort of realize is part of the value out of what we're getting from a certain pathway we take. And who has long-term ownership of your work? Obviously, if you're on a salary someplace, they're owning your stuff. If you're in a smaller environment, it can be completely yours. One of those trade-offs that I think sometimes we forget, we think about, like, indie development seeming more risky than the big environments, is I've got peers who spent years at giant company, X, Y, or Z, making some humongous project that never shipped. And so they have a 3 or 4 year dent in which they can't actually even show anything from it because the game doesn't exist. They're not even allowed legally to talk much about it because the game was behind NDAs. That's pretty rough. Now, they got paid for that time, and as long as they're still happy with their lives outside of that, that's great. But goodness, there's still risk involved. It's just a different kind and scale of risk, at which when those kind of things happen, it's not because of any given individual's fault. It's because of forces much bigger than them, and that's part of the risk that we take if we take that kind of path. And lastly, it's working with people that you choose. I think a lot of us know that when you're at a big company, there's necessarily politics of working with a bunch of people who are kind of strangers beyond your control, whereas smaller environments, part of what we strive for, part of what we drive for, the joy of working with a smaller team, is it's just nicer to be able to look around and know what the other 3 or 4 to 5 people are doing, or 12 people are doing, and kind of where they all fit into the picture. Speaking of which, it really does, especially now in 2017, take a team to do it commercially. There was maybe a year or two hiccup about a decade ago when there was still kind of 1 or 2 person teams really, really nailing it out of the park occasionally. Anymore, it is the stories happen. It's not that it's totally impossible, but they are literally ones out of thousands and thousands of efforts that we actually hear about. There's this fine illustration here from the movie Ip Man, which is great. But like a lot of kung fu movies, shows like 10 people fighting one, which is almost this comic illustration of, we kind of know in reality, like even a few people of mediocre strength and mediocre training can kind of pretty easily dominate kind of someone else who's otherwise reasonably a skilled fighter. There's part of why, like, weight classes exist in sports. It turns out that even a small group of people is a major multiplier. And the same thing's true, less visually, when we're doing game development. Having 3 to 4 to 5 people, while we still in our brain categorize that as a small team, is a massive, like, 3 to 4 times as much, not just time, but ability to focus in on specific kinds of efforts and issues about the game, about whether it's sound design, art, whether it's level design, whatever it is. And even if it's people who can multi-purpose. So I've seen a lot of teams succeed where, even though anyone on the team could have kind of filled any of the roles, when one person's there purely wearing the level designer hat, or one person's there purely wearing the hat of the artist, it just allows the whole thing to excel in a way it can't when the same person has to constantly be bouncing back and forth between that's eating time out of when they're trying to code, or do other things for the team, or deal with business matters. This guy is not going to make the next hit song this way, and he might lose his mind by trying. And I think that when we start to see solo developers, we start to see ourselves as solo developers, to realize that we're kind of doing this stunt. And it feels good, because it feels satisfying to pull it off, but the output is just not on the same caliber as even a handful of people who are kind of each playing their own instrument correctly. And again, I said this is the last episode, I'm going to ramp with extra credits, but the second one was also dedicated to team game development. Even cases where we kind of associate a studio with, or even an indie studio with 1 or 2 developers, typically the games they release have at least a handful of other contractors involved. They're just not as prominent since they weren't driving the core vision for the team. Game industry, especially indie, and I've cut it this earlier a little bit, but it's increasing like any other creative industry. And this has several implications. And does anybody know who these guys are?
Yeah.
id, that's right. Yes, this is a 90s picture of John Carmack, John Romero, Tom Hall. I think Adrian Carmack's in there, some other folks. And back then, in the early 90s, they got kind of popularized this phrase that they just made the game they wanted to play. And I don't remember which one of these guys said that, but that was kind of philosophy to making Doom, was like, oh, that's why it's so grungy and punk. And The reality is, when you are the only person in the world capable of achieving a 3D looking game on a pre-floating point processor with a 386, you can do that. Anymore, lots of people can do that. And so it's much closer anymore. Making a game is less like there's a handful of people in the world capable of doing it. And obviously now many, many, many people can do it. It's closer to playing an instrument. Which is to say, like, not everyone can, but so many people can. That to do it at a professional level requires this incredible amount of hustle. This next level of how do you make your stuff stand out. This is a point borrowed from Jared Huntley. He gave a talk at my GameDevBiz.com online conference. And, like, he really thinks about it as touring when he takes his game to conferences. And very much is trying to build the same kind of connections, the same kind of feedback loops in as when musicians realize that there's a separation between just performing the music and really succeeding as a business person in it. And to kind of dig deeper into a few of those, it's literally done at a loss for years. And this has been true for the indie music scene forever. Lots of people who we assume are making pretty good bank, or we've heard of their bands or whatever, are really still kind of losing money or eking by sleeping on couches while they're touring. Same is often true. Indies who you've heard of their work's gotten awards, whatever, are still very much scrapping and trying to make it work. It's still not being done as profitably as it might look from the outside. It often involves a ton of work and social effort outside of just making actual music one-on-one. Like, you don't just get to crank out song after song. These people are having to go out there and repeat their stuff again and again forever. And this is the same sort of thing that if what you like to do is just make game after game after game, it's none of those are getting the attention or love that they need in terms of getting the word out there about them, in terms of really marrying one long enough to really get enough traction to go someplace. And then lastly, this one's kind of heartbreaking, but it's also just kind of, may as well be kind of just upfront about it. Most people who attempt it will never be a breakout success, but attempting it in earnest is the only way anyone ever has a shot to. If the load is long and difficult and uncertain, that's still the only road there. And that's just kind of the state of trying to compete in an internet, like industrial art at a commercial level. And because of this distinction, a merely good game earns essentially nothing, or at the very least negligible compared to what its cost would be. There's sort of exceptional, and those can obviously do very well, and there's lots of other things that in the middle, there's not just like, oh, decent, making decent earnings. Once we can kind of draw a string from the music industry in terms of thinking of the top 40 or the top 100 even, and most songs created by most musicians are never anywhere near this. And while it seems almost like an absurd comparison, that very much is kind of what's going on with Steam's front page, with the front page of the App Store, and so on, in terms of which games are really making a lot of money and which games are sort of negligible. Now, that's something that we've kind of very recently, because of the indie bubble, have kind of been thinking about things like coming from how it's changed since even Xbox Live or those kind of things. But I've actually got a note from, I think, 2005, before the indie scene blew up, and Bing Gordon, founder of EA, was actually talking at the time about how even then, 1,000 games a year were coming out of which really 30 were as many as people really heard of or thought about. Like 30 games kind of defined the year out of the 1,000 that poured out, which is to say that, again, you got to find how to get head and shoulders above the rest. It's not like there's just a bunch of space in the middle. Middle space, decent space is already behind. This is also the case, again, other industries. Anytime there's a publishing layer, and this part of the publishing layer exists in games, it's because most of the projects lose money. Most music CDs lose money, most books lose money, and what a publishing layer exists to do is try to balance that risk out so that their massive hits help offset their losses, and as an exchange, the author or creator, or game developers in this case, can keep their lights on while they do it, one project to the next, check to check, while they're trying to help make those work under the trade-off that if it succeeds, they're earning less of the overall cap from it. So even though publishers can be seen as kind of evil, and there are publishers who are not that great, and I wouldn't recommend working with necessarily any given one about some due diligence, they do serve a perfectly reasonable function in the industry where lots of games we've enjoyed have come through published layers, and there's a reason for that as a business, that makes things possible that wouldn't be possible without their sort of power to work with. Now that said, publishers. This is something that also we see increasingly people getting frustrated by. Platforms are not your publisher. Apple, Steam, Google, Facebook, etc. Aren't your employees. They don't work for you. It's not their job to get out there and peddle your stuff. Now, it is kind of your job, if you put your game on their platform, to make something enticing enough to their customers that it's incentivizing to them to want to front and center it, to go out of their way to put it in front of more people's hands. But at the end of the day, they have enough stuff to deal with. I think Steam is at this point maybe 13 games a day. Most mobile platforms are in the hundreds of games released per day. The numbers that they're working with are pretty staggering. There's actually this kind of like fairly intimidating and unfriendly line from Apple's App Store review guidelines that if your app looks like it was cobbled together in a few days, or you're trying to get your first practice app into the store to impress your friends, please brace yourself for rejection. We have lots of serious developers who don't want their quality apps to be surrounded by amateur hour. Which is rough, especially because I'll talk about in a little bit, iPhone is one of these spaces, or smartphones are one of these spaces where people kind of feel looks more accessible, and it really is kind of aggressively not the case. No matter what platform you're on, it's worthwhile to consider your platform and audience. That's not kind of a one-size-fits-all solution. There's this problem whenever someone's new to any kind of line of business that they'll kind of assume, oh, my game's for everyone, or my customer is everyone. Generally, this isn't the case, and the better we can get a more specific answer than that, the better we can actually position our game in front of the right kind of people who will like it. Figuring out what that overlap is might kind of match up with what you like, but it doesn't easily do so. Have kind of a Venn diagram here, not drawn to scale at all. But it's finding an overlap between what you feel like making, but also what others like to play that isn't already out there, which you can kind of just prototype or test to find out, as well as what fits in today's channels or ways people pay for them. And this is one of those sort of things that affects the degree to which difficult games are or aren't appreciated, the degree to which games that have story components, or multiplayer components, or procedural content, or otherwise do and don't work in the current economy, but finding that intersection of spaces where there's actually a business opportunity, which is separate from games that would be fun to make. Which again, as someone who, like, I advocate doing things as a hobby occasionally, by all means make those games, but it's important to be strategic about which ones are worth investing in or pushing harder on in terms of trying to get press coverage and so on. The type of game you grew up playing may no longer be a viable market space. This is something that, again, I've also seen affect lots of peers, certainly affected me in terms of the kind of games that I liked when I was a kid. By the time I was doing games professionally, weren't really the kind of games that people were paying for anymore. And just very recently, and these are both things like November 1st, in both cases, we've had a studio shut down in Finland that tried to do an arcade shoot 'em up, and their conclusion was, at least at their scale of studio, that's kind of not where the market's at anymore. Morgan Jaffet here being pretty upfront about the fact that, and this is also something I've been hearing pretty consistently from peers, a couch co-op game or a couch competitive game, one of these kind of shared screen games, they show very well at festivals, but they are incredibly hard to make back money on. That they're just kind of not where the market space is. In the same way as like when I was a little kid playing Bubble Bobble with my older brother, co-op local games made sense. When Halo 1 came out, co-op games made sense locally. Any more of those things show well at festivals, which can be deceiving because we sometimes have this mismatch between what we see or hear about doing well there, assuming that there's a next wave or bubble happening of it. And often that doesn't necessarily translate to what people actually buy because it's just not how people play games in 2017. Related to this is that your own projects very probably won't be the main income in the foreseeable future. This is true even if you're starting a studio. And the hard part of starting a business, if you're going about this as a business, is reliably connecting effort to earnings. And this will very rarely come out of original IP. Now, the friends I've got who run VR studios started their studio by taking contract work doing VR games for outside companies. The friends I have who do web game studios or Unity studios or whatever, their consistent income still comes from contract work from the outside. The indies I know who had successful indie games in the early kind of IGF space were also doing contract work on the side. A lot of them don't talk about that stuff at conferences just because it's not interesting. They're not hiding it. It's just like not as cool as their game, but they're doing kind of work for other people that's not as interesting, not as cool, may not even be credited on it because that's where the income comes from that keeps their lights on while they can sustainably do the stuff that they're doing. I love this slide. This is from Jake Burkett, Gray Alien Games. This is from my Enjoy GameDev.com online conference I put on a couple months ago. And this is showing his breakdown of income sources over the past decade as a game developer. And it's a little bit hard to see here, but the blue is his games. And other than that, it's some form or another of working for other people. He was an employee for a few years, did some consultancy for the time in the middle, did some contract work filling in the cracks. But the graph that shows it even better is this one. And this is actually a fairly standard kind of graph for lots of other indies, the ones who don't necessarily make it kind of like super mega millions big, is that instead their income won't actually change dramatically over the years, but they can shift the ratio of how much of it is outside projects versus their own IP. And again, this is something I've seen affect medium-sized studios, big studios, solo individuals, small teams, etc. all kind of equivalently, is a lot of the work early on is accepting there's still going to be some work for the outside to keep the lights on, and how can I shift that ratio with a flexibility that affords my own schedule to replace that over time with my own IP or my own projects or my own audience building. Most projects aren't worth polishing. You need a great deal of experience to tell the difference, but this is something I'm a big fan of, is making ugly games to figure out what's worth making less ugly. Does anybody know what this game became? Yeah, that's right, Splatoon. There it is. Yeah, this is one of my slides I borrowed from my previous talk. Or to decide what to move forward on, you can use outside evidence of traction. And so this is one where Vision by Proxy, second edition, is one of these stories I have where it began as a student project before I was even involved with it. That project got a chance to show at the Indiecade E3 booth. That was well received enough that we made a second version, further investing time, a year or two into it, bigger team. That game got 7 million plays internationally, which then led to us making Miss Vision by Proxy, by which time we had business prospects approaching us for it. But at each stage of that, there was a chance to kind of like go out there, workshop it, put it in front of people, find out who's it going to, who's receiving it. And also it involved a lot of very proactive work from our side in terms of submitting it to festivals, bringing it out to places, taking it to meetups, putting it in front of other people. But at each stage of the way, there wasn't this automatic assumption we move forward on it. It was sort of a continued foot deeper kind of dip into the water to figure out, is this get traction? Do we have evidence that this is worth investing in further? Keeping timer costs very low when exploring is something I'm a massive fan of. It enables you to have more creative freedom. You can practice finishing before it counts. And just like with Vision by Proxy, you might find there's external validation of like, oh, there's really something here. There's like this seed of a thing here that's not fully realized that people are enjoying. And that's the ideal case where you can go back there with confidence of you're digging because there's something there. And this finishing practice before it counts is one that's also very close to my heart, since increasingly a lot of people's experience winds up being game jams. It becomes very hard to translate from that to releasing a title in a longer time frame. I think it's very worthwhile to get practice at working on bigger timescales, finishing the games, releasing them. So when it comes time for a game, you've kind of already stepped through some of those hurdles before it's kind of a do or die situation. Crowdfunding is not free or easy money. This is increasingly also probably entering the common sense realm. But I like this one in part because I've got this great slide from Tabby Rose of Quinch Game, which I misspelled Quinch, Q-U-E-N-C-H. I'll fix that in the slide after. But she was one of our speakers for EnjoyGameDev.com, one of my co-organizers for IndieCade Talks. And this is her slide from her preparations for their successful Kickstarter. Their game was successfully Kickstarted in addition to some government grant backing and other stuff. But they very much put a month or two of work solid into trying to anticipate up ahead of time how to prepare and launch this campaign successfully. And so it doesn't become a question of like, well, you know, what would we do if we got this money? It's very much of, can this money at least make back the time that we're losing preparing to do a campaign correctly? And how can we guarantee we make at least X amount from like day one to improve our odds of success in the campaign and so on? There's a lot of homework to be done. It's still a viable direction. Some people do it, but it's to recognize there's a considerable amount of business work that goes into doing a Kickstarter campaign correctly. Outside assets, and this is somewhat a personal thing, also reflected by most of the peers I work with, but outside assets should be used either not at all or very, very sparingly for background stuff. And it tends to be a black hole for money. I mean, a lot of folks who they buy a lot of assets and don't wind up using them, or if they have it as the core of their game, as their main player character, as an enemy character, as otherwise, it just doesn't really fit. It doesn't fit the style. They can't extend it. They can't modify it. It limits their design. It begins to feel a little bit too much like you're building a game out of Legos. And it's something where I would far, out of the people I train, the people I work with, very much be strong proponents of learn the content tools well enough to make your own placeholders, even if they're not beautiful, just placeholder stuff so you can tell what it is until you can justify through evidence of traction that it's worth reinvesting in justifying custom artwork to replace it. If you've only made games with an engine, Unity, Unreal, or otherwise, Game Maker or whatnot, I encourage making a few without one. And your method of doing that could be whatever's up to you. Low-level people might choose C++ and SFML. Anymore, I tend to teach JavaScript and Canvas without any sort of outside libraries, so no phaser and that kind of stuff. But the example we use for this is that's a bit like using a graphing calculator. It's incredibly powerful, but if you've only used a graphing calculator and haven't done these things by hand with paper and pencil, it can become a little more mysterious how it's doing or why it's doing what it's doing. And we tend to find people who get the most product out of Unity, Unreal, or these other platforms are those who've also made games without them, because it helps us give us ideas of what we can override, what we can further do to make it our own, how we can avoid it having that default feel that otherwise comes from using one of these common platform choices, all of which are good choices, but still good to kind of go in there with a deeper understanding. One of my points, and I kind of make this one quick because it's hard to say enough about it. It's its own talk, but mobile is not a good platform for indies. Hasn't been for a while. It's an incredibly hard fight to pick when you're early on, maybe ever at indie scale anymore. But it's got this reputation of seeming very accessible in a way that it just is not. It's a very fragmented space, which makes it hard to test unless you have a full suite of different devices. Very, very hard to get visibility in a way that's not comparable to the other platforms. Literally an order of magnitude more games released per day. And again, it's not really on the platform holders. They won't help. They don't care unless the thing is so exceptional that you might not need their help anyway at that scale. Web games are delightfully cross-platform. Tends to be what I advocate as an early point. If only trying to get traffic numbers to prove things, it's much more persuasive to be able to say you've had 100,000 or 3 million plays on a game than it is to say the kind of numbers you can typically get off of a downloadable executable if it's not going through an established platform. It gives people less of a security concern issue since browsers are typically mostly sandboxed. And there's performance limits. There's absolutely some performance limits compared to a downloadable thing in terms of frame rate. But if you can get the core concept sold in this way, it can sometimes be a springboard to doing something more high performance with it. And this is also something we've seen happen pretty reliably with indie scene stuff, where at some point there might have been a free web game, and then from that it finds its way into becoming a console or sometimes a mobile port. Which, speaking of which, A lot of web code today can still be adapted for mobile with minimal additions, which is one of the things that also makes HTML5 or JS kind of a nice choice early on for platforms. Luck favors the persistent. And this point's just kind of, I like to end on, it's a little bit silly. But there was this example from many years ago where I was scrolling channels, and the history channel shows this guy with how berserkers fought with an axe. And apparently, one axe fighting technique is this: keep the axe swinging. Because if you draw back, then you're vulnerable. And so I kind of like this as a metaphor for you just want to keep making games. At any given time, you don't want to be at a gap between making them. And what happens is that as long as you're making games, which has been the case for me for now like about 2 decades, whenever I'm someplace and there's someone who's like, hey, do you have a game you want to talk about? Do you have a game you want to show? Is there a project you want to help pitch here? There's always something I'm doing in the middle of, sometimes some things, that I can speak to. And being in the right place at the right time, you can kind of hack that a little bit if you're kind of always in the right place until the right time comes along. And there's no real cheat to that. It's just, you just keep making stuff. Back to back making stuff. And it keeps your practice up, keeps you fluent. The other thing we tend to see happen is when people wind their cycles down, it becomes incredibly hard to spin their cycles back up. There's this momentum problem that gets lost in the process. I'm going to basically end on a line that I like from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. This is, I think, very important when we're early in our careers. But we judge ourselves by what we feel capable of doing, while others judge us by what we've already done. We necessarily are projecting into our future a little bit about what we're capable of. Others will believe it when they see it. This is part of why, again, just cranking out stuff is valuable. Whether you're looking for contract work or collaborators, if they can see something out of your projects that speaks to that's kind of thing that they're looking for that you've already done, their confidence is much higher that you can do it. And more so, you're in a much stronger negotiating position that you have proof you can do the thing you say you're there to do. That's it. As far as the plan to talk stuff, I help people navigate this stuff. I'm looking forward to answering questions. Let's chat. I'm Gamketo on Twitter and the website, or Chris DeLeon on either as well. Any questions or things?
I have one. How often do you make games? When do you stop and move on to the next project?
Sure. So most projects I work on that are sort of exploratory, meaning I've not yet decided to invest any real money or any serious major time at it, it's kind of a 1 to 5 month time frame. Sometimes those are staggered, so there might be like a little 1 monther stuck between 5 monthers. If it's a longer scope time frame, so Vision by Proxy 2nd edition was an 18-month game. That said, some of the commercial games for early iPhone, Topple was 2 months. Alice in Bomberland was, I guess, 8 months. But those kind of time scales are the ones I work in. Those are often cases, too, where if it's not publisher funded, you're either having to find income from somewhere else, whether it's contract work, in which case it becomes dictated by the contract, or some other kind of job you hold down, which, again, sounds kind of like don't quit your day job silliness, but is like very real for lots of games we play and enjoy came from someone who, at the time, they were making their income doing something else. Military training software, flashcard software, teaching, totally unrelated stuff.
I know a lot of the games that you've made recently that I found popular have been on mobile. Do you say that, like, because I remember, like, just a few minutes ago, you said that mobile wasn't a good space for new developers. Why, like, is it just because people, whenever you go to play mobile games, they look for, like, more polished games, or is it, like, I don't know, because I feel like there's definitely plenty of unpolished games that still get really popular.
So it's a tricky space for a number of reasons. One, there's literally 500 to 700 mobile games released a day. And so when we look at it and we say like, oh, but we see some games that are unpolished to make it through, there's like this Flappy Bird effect of there's literally one Flappy Bird lightning strike out of history that gets called upon as like, oh, look, this guy didn't mean to, and then broke out on the ads. Part of it is that the space is much more of a bloodbath now of dominant parties than it used to be. When my iOS hits, like my number 2 top paid app in 2008, it was early enough in the mobile market that big companies didn't take it seriously. Like EA wasn't there. Zynga kind of semi didn't exist in mobile at the time. They were still in Facebook casual. And like these are all things that changed dramatically. Once it became clear like there was money to be made there, then there's companies that are dousing significant ad spend on acquiring users for the mobile in a way that you're fighting against those people for shelf space. Mobile winds up in a territory where the same handful of titles tend to kind of dominate the year on the device. And again, this is out of a truly, truly staggering number of new games released on it. Out of them, the games that tend to do well are, and again, there's probably exceptions, but often not someone's first game. It's someone else who has been kind of like much more deliberative about both designing around the platform's specific nuances, developing around, in some cases, like how they can craft their product in a way that fits the way the advertising space works, or the way that Crossy Road's a fine example of a game that very well wrapped around the way that ad incentives kind of work in the game. Or they're people who are already very plugged into like the press community. And oftentimes, and again, like these earlier things, like, you know, is the best musician in the world the one who's necessarily on the stage getting paid for it? Of course not. Like, that's not how reality works. There's a bunch of other connections that have to happen for a game to really get that kind of recognition, which includes potentially access to maybe second connections to people who decide which kind of stuff is featured, so it's on their radar. People who know kind of like how to get things published and written about in press and can kind of pull off a thunderclap campaign in time for launch. People who can kind of plan these sort of things, which is different than, can you like craft a decent game on it? The vast majority of expenses that go into indie mobile stuff, especially for early projects, is kind of throwing money into a fire. It's projects that may as well kind of have been done as a hobby project, which would be fine. Again, totally fine. By all means, make a practice game, explore the space, and if you find that, oh, there's really a thing here, and you can use that to justify further investment. But I think it's a very terrifying black hole. And this has also been consistent again with like my friends who run contracting studios, where when they were deciding where to put their own IP, their own kind of deep due diligence was like, there be dragons. Yeah. And again, there's also just a lot more fragmentation in the space than it used to be. One of the upsides of, to a degree, browser stuff is like it's so widely compatible, versus, or at least you can test for different resolutions and stuff you're trying to do responsive. On mobile devices, like there's a lot more fragmentation than there used to be in terms of like, I've had problems when I did Alice in Borderland, this would have even been 6-7 years ago, where like the game only ran poorly on a certain version of the iPhone with a certain version of the iOS that people hadn't updated. And like, without having a suite of 16 different devices to test, like my publisher did, there's no way I would have caught that. And those things wind up kind of ripping you up in the reviews if your product or your game kind of like falls apart on certain Android configurations, certain resolutions, certain processors, in a way that just kind of like, you can do it. It's just that's a lot more legwork than if like early on your focus is kind of should be like, what is the game I'm building and how to get that working the way I need it to.
In successful indie games that you've seen, how have like the teams been put together? Like how did they come together to make this game outside of Barter Studio environment?
Right on. Yeah. So it varies. Again, like in one, this is I realize kind of like almost an unhelpful cheat answer. In some cases, it's people who quit studio life together. And that's where like they already knew from they'd been coworkers someplace. And like there's non-competes and stuff, at least in California, stuff often enforceable. I'm not a lawyer, so can't quote me on that or don't hold me accountable to that. But that's often been the case in California. People have found, perhaps. And oftentimes people meet each other in schools, in clubs, like perhaps the club that you were in. The past 2 clubs that I started in the current club give people an environment where they build games together, where they figure out like this person delivers, this person's accountable, this person's really go get him and smart and quick learner and cares, and this person isn't. And it's much easier to throw in with somebody when you kind of like are really counting on and can trust that like they're going to deliver at least as well or better than you can on their end of the bargain on stuff. The other part is in the nature of doing that kind of outside work that kind of keeps a light on, whether it's contract work, whether it's some other software engineering role, whatever, does it project management and a different industry, whatever. We tend to make other connections, and like those people we find that way sometimes might turn out to also be really good connections for future projects. I know people who we had a speaker for GameDev Biz, blanking on his name, Amir Rao, founder of Supergiant Games, and a bunch of people who like when his studio were young, like first of all he founded it out of like his dad's basement while he just like lived with his dad for a while. But a lot of his people he started a studio with were like people he kind of knew for years or knew growing up or like used to work somewhere else with, some who weren't even necessarily like game connections when he first met them. And it's kind of keeping your eyes open to like, could be anybody anywhere. One of the kind of other side to that coin is that it can be a little bit tricky if we only try to ever think of assembling a team based on people we already know. While that certainly is the comfort zone, and certainly there's advantages to having people you can trust when a company environment's very small, there's a lot of talent and a lot of skill and a lot of stuff, just know-how out there, which is not going to be in our circles, which is not going to be in our social friend group. And that's kind of the nature of like trying to find people through active searching. And there's a whole kind of art and science to that, like kind of HR search difficulty. But, you know, like if it comes down to the same sort of thing of like if you have legal questions, like a lawyer has to be the answer. If you have financial questions, a financial person has to be the answer. When I had games that I needed a artist for and I knew I could pay an artist, kind of went through a process of finding, screening applicants, going through portfolios to find who to work with, trying to negotiate those deals and whatever in a way that like I didn't know those people before the project. And so that was kind of a one-off contract for the game. Thereafter, we could kind of figure out if we want to try to start something more long-term, there wasn't some ongoing expectation of like we were in it together.
Do you think it's best to start with making prototypes of different games for different genres, or is it best starting off with making a full game for respective genres as you're still trying to either find your niche or just feel out the market?
It's I mean, a little. This is one of these cases where the information have to be really contextual, a little bit on what on what like someone's personal objectives or priorities are. I think there's obviously value in exploring. There's also value in prototyping practice. I think that anymore with game jam scene being what it is, there's a lot of people who have prototyping skills that don't have sort of finishing skills. I think the compromise space, and a lot of what I teach people when they're first starting out and the kind of process I do in my video courses, is sort of making like semi-finished games to a degree, not commercially polished, but has a menu and kind of works or whatever. But starting by kind of cloning retro stuff and then working your way up through history, that like necessarily Atari era stuff was constrained just because it didn't have any RAM and processor was garbage, storage was garbage, that like couldn't be that sophisticated. But if you can like kind of like make that kind of well, then you kind of incrementally ratchet it up by just kind of following history forward a few years and then try to make that kind of reasonably well. And obviously when we're doing these kind of things, like it's not to commercialize those. It's more like just like if we were trying to learn music or cooking or something, we'd first follow existing songs or we'd first cook recipes to get to know our instrument. And in much the same way, I think that doing those kind of practice projects kind of helps build up our kind of muscle memory or kind of concept tool belt, both also just code we've personally kind of tackled through, hurdles we've kind of gone through about kind of releasing a project in a way that kind of builds a very natural ramp when self-educating if we use history as the guide. But yeah, I don't know if there's a single universal answer. What I will say is that I think I've seen enough people flame out on morale from trying to take on something too big for them to chew, that it's worth erring in favor of too small at first and trying to do a really polished job of something small. Lots of things that do well are a very, very polished small game instead of a spread themselves thin on something huge. It can be kind of fun to spread yourself thin on something huge as long as you still are okay with how it finishes. But like usually the audience for that is the team who made it, because like it's this concept where you look at it and know what you're going for, but it's just never going to come anywhere close to, you know, the possible vision it could have had. And I just want to throw in there too, something I used to have in my presentations, I guess I nixed out of this current one, is an encouragement that when you're working on this kind of projects to not feel like you have to reinvent every piece about it. General manager of EA LA when I was out there, Neil Young, had this kind of great philosophy of like a few key innovations, like 1 to 3 things about the game that are really kind of different, but that the rest you just kind of like stick to the convention, like you accept the established norm for it. Because I think that sometimes we have all these feelings from when we're playing games like, oh, health should be done differently and sprint should be done differently and weapons should be done differently, everything should be done differently. And it becomes like an experiment where you're changing every variable and you've kind of got no ground to sit on. And I think that also just for a player understanding what the heck's going on, like if it has some assumptions in there, like you're clearing all the enemies off the screen, or there's a score, or there's hit points, or something that they understand, then it can help them kind of better understand the few things you're doing that are quirky or unusual that help stand out of the hook. And I think that's kind of a useful way to think about that balance of, you know, it has to be different, but for a lot of it, you really can kind of lean into like, there's an established way to do things for a reason. And if nothing else is what the players expect, it's going to control a certain way or that kind of thing.
Do you have any advice for a first-time leadership position in a new project or a current project?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I work with lots of project leads. Let's see. So for one thing, on a small team, I think a project lead has to be doing other things besides just leading. They're often also carrying a reasonable amount of code or design, or I've had project leads who found sound effects and music and whatever the heck they had to do. I think that I'm real big on having a tentative schedule. So even if there's this like sense that we want to keep working on it until it's done, being able to get everybody to kind of agree to like, okay, but we're launching a version of this by the end of November, or we're launching a version of this by February or whatever. agreeing that that is the initial target, which gives people kind of a chance to schedule their lives around it. Working backwards from that with weekly goals, where we kind of ask, okay, so every single week, what would any person on this team be doing? And, you know, you kind of work backwards to figure out how many slots you've got in that time. You can always pivot that design, but if you do, then it allows you to, like, concretely rearrange that schedule. A lot of us use Trello in the clubs for this kind of thing, where we'll have columns for this a week, and then cards in there for a task that week, and rearrange them or slide them or replace them as we need. I used to use Excel for that stuff before Trello was as good as it is. Let's see, other project lead stuff. I think there's a tendency for first-time project leads to want to be overly general on trying to, like, please everyone, where they're like, okay, well, we're going to do, like, a platformer, and it could be in the fantasy world, or it could be future, but it could be, like, you know, modern combat or whatever. And the problem with that is, like, it seems like it's going to please more people. It's going to actually, like, frustrate more people, because when it's so open-ended, people don't know what they're getting on board for, and they're all going to join with different expectations of where it's going, and then it's necessarily going to not be all of those. And it's kind of like, you know, if you ask people, do you want to get on a bus and go somewhere? Like, no one's getting on that bus. That's creepy. But if you say, like, you want to go on a bus to Miami, like, there's few people who want to go to exactly Miami, but they know they want to go to Miami, so they're going to go on that bus. And so I find it's really useful for a project lead to be able to spell out, like, look, we might change this if the team decides to, but right now we're going to call it this. It's going to be this kind of game. It's going to be this kind of view based on the screenshot of this other game. Here's kind of a mood board for it. If you're on board with what this is, come on board. And it also means that anybody else who's getting involved already has more agreement and sign on from the outset as to, like, okay, but is this action or is this strategy or whatever, to be able to lay that flag in the ground and be like, come over here if you're into this, because that's what we're building a team for. I find works out way better in the long term.
I'm kind of in the middle of my first semester at college. I've always,
Exciting times.
Frustrating. I've always really liked to play video games. Always thought it'd be awesome to make them. And I know it's not for everybody, but I'm hoping it's for me. So I guess a couple things. I don't really like math, or I'm trying to figure out whether it's just that I don't like to do my homework, or if I just don't like to do math specifically, or something. And also, but I guess it's not. I've mostly wanted to, like, maybe niche games or something, and do it like a hobby, like we were talking about earlier. And possibly, if they seem to start to gain ground, maybe invest more in it. But my main career is probably going to be something else.
Yeah. So first of all, in terms of math, like, for what it's worth, so Amir Rao, Supergiant's founder, part of his talk was, like, he's not a programmer at all. He's not a technical person, doesn't like math. Started his company, his studio's done well with Bastion and Transistor, more recently Pyre. It's totally possible to be, like, there's lots of game industry jobs that aren't programmer. There's lots of other roles. The reason why at indie scale or small team scale we tend to often emphasize, like, but you got to code, is because we don't have a salary to pay some software engineer to do it for us, to be like, make my spec happen. We just don't have the kind of money. Software engineers are expensive. But if we can, like, tug our own shirt and be like, spend your evenings doing this for me, myself, and I'm like, okay. That's why most of us wind up programming. It's kind of a means to an end. That's it too. The other thing about, like, math, there's, like, lots of different kinds of math, and it's part of what I didn't figure out until college was really when it hit me. Like, I was kind of vaguely aware in high school. It was like, it seemed like trig, like, was naturally just followed algebra, and, like, geometry was in the middle. But, like, man, when you get to college, like, my God, like, discrete mathematics is a completely different set of problems than calculus, which is, like, a whole different set of way of dealing with things. And, like, I'm not a statistics person. I'm not a calculus person. I kind of did okay in discrete mathematics. And that's kind of, like, actually a little bit more related to game programming stuff. And for that matter, too, a lot of the math that we do in games, like, we use a lot of trig for game programming stuff. There's, like, 2 or 3 things about trig that we use all the time, which out of, like, an entire trigonometry class might have been, like, 1 question out of 2 assignments that were, like, this specific thing I just keep using trig for. And so I'm never, like, really solving for X or, like, doing long algebra division or whatever. It's more so I just kind of figure out, like, this is a problem I need trig for. And I just, like, tell the computer, like, use trig to do a thing. Same thing happens in Unity where, like, quaternions are this, like, modestly sophisticated concept in, like, if you're taking a class and they're trying to teach you quaternions, like, it's kind of a nightmare. But in Unity, it's like, oh yeah, it's an angles problem in 3D. I need quats for this. But quaternion, point this thing at that thing. And then the Unity engine just does the, like, quaternion nastiness.
I was pretty decent at geometry, actually, and I almost enjoyed the triangle stuff. That what trigonometry is?
Yeah, trig the triangle stuff. Geometry is also useful. Yeah, and this is not to like poo-poo math at all, but yeah, it's a different set of math used in game programming. There's also a whole bunch you can get. A lot of game programming is basically arithmetic. It's just a lot of it. So yeah, I think it'll probably be fine. Especially again, like if you want to just build stuff. One of the other stories I like that somebody's doing these talks is like, so did anybody know what The Marriage is? It's this old art game by Rod Humble.
What was that?
Marriage, The Marriage, like wedded, like married people. Rod Humble made this game called The Marriage, and it has like circles and squares. This was probably a decade ago. It was real big in the indie scene. Experimental gameplay workshops at GDC had presentations about it from the developer. And like the circle is the husband and the square is the wife, or vice versa. And there's these other groups and these lines and circles, and those are people at the party, and how they get close to each other affects the whatever. Like this is very artsy thing. This tiny game with like colored shapes in it. And at the same time, that guy was the like vice president of EA Max's Sims division or something on expansion packs. And like when interviewed about that, they were like, "Doesn't this seem like these two don't jibe? Like, how are you making this art game and also shipping like different fabric couches for the Sims to sit on?" And he was like, "Well, like this thing should exist. No one in the right mind should like pay for what this thing is. So he made it exist the way it makes sense to it that. And then there's like a market for this other thing, as much as there is for like McDonald's fries. And like there's no wrong thing about delivering on that need. So that's fine." And lots of people I know anymore who like make games, when they keep like a frankly, I don't mean to say negative things about the industry, but like higher paying, more stable job with similar skills, software engineering at some other company X, Y, or Z, where on the outside of it, they feel comfortable and safe kind of just like chipping away, making their games on the off hours they have. Then like they have total freedom and flexibility to do whatever they feel like. They're not having constrained of like, oh, our first game sold her well, like we have to do a sequel. Like I'm stuck with this thing now. Or like, oh, microtransactions are all the rage now, so we got to do, how do we redesign our game around it? They just don't care. They just make whatever they feel like, and that's kind of like freeing. There's something nice, obviously, to like being able to devote the full work energy to it, if and when that overlaps with someone's kind of what they're seeking out of life. But yes, there's also super nothing wrong with or derogatory about like making games as a hobby or on the side, or just otherwise making sure you can responsibly pay your bills while still doing what's frankly moonlighting an indie project. Totally fine too. John Kane, Australian developer, I think it's John Kane, was on my podcast talking about how like he keeps a job doing, I think it's web development or something, so he could then like responsibly pay his artists and pay other people to like make his games look comfortably decent and better than other people's stuff, and not having to do is like, we really want it really shaky and nasty in indie space. And it's kind of like sympathetic because like nobody wants to do this, but like they don't feel like they have another option. Is they'll try to like get involved in a commercial project together, but like none of them have any money, and they're all kind of like, oh, if this does succeed, then you'll get paid 15% or whatever. Like those are so unlikely to make money. It's essentially, in most cases, by my experience, way better that this is a commercial, like non-commercial practice project. Let's try it together and see if it picks up, and if it does, then we can try to figure out what to do with an actual sequel or a more serious endeavor or find outside funding or something. But it just gets real squishy and gross if people try to like, hey, I've got this idea, I'll give you some percentage of unlikely outcome. It gets real rocky in those cases of just not very, winds up being nobody getting paid, but a lot of stress over it anyway.
So I know a lot of like indie developers, especially like they do what you're talking about. It's like having another job themselves, and to either like chip away at a certain project or do like prototypes consecutively, like smaller ones. And then if one of them like does better than the rest, then they basically like, or like they basically save money from their main job, and then basically like whenever they find a prototype that they think can be commercial, it's like then they quit their job and then try and make it commercial. Is that like a reasonable like thing to do like after college?
Yeah, well, so again, and there's I'm a big prone to that. A handful of my profitable iOS games came out of, I spent 7 months making nightly gameplay prototype things, out of which most of them were total trash. Some of them are offensive. All of them are hidden from the internet now. But some of them were like, I was like, hey, there's something kind of here, and so I would like reinvest energy in doing that better. Clooney Games started that way. This is a Crayon Physics guy, pretty famously 2D boy, Ron Carmel and Kyle Gray. Tower of Goo came out of a similar process, the Experimental Gameplay Workshop, or whatever it was called, at Experimental Gameplay Series at Carnegie Mellon's ETC. So yeah, it's totally a thing, this like prototyping sequence. Kristen McFunky Pants, guy I work with my Gamketo Club with, he's one of our collaborative mentors. He does the 1 game a month movement, which is like just encouraging people to like every single month crank out a game. It doesn't matter if it's a 1-day jam or if it's a whole month game or whatever. Keep making game stuff. And the hope of like, yeah, at some point, like timing might kind of line up of like, I could not have predicted this would come out so well. Like there's like my friends like this. I kind of like this. People are actually playing this because the internet's really handy for getting stats on. The one thing I will say, I'm a proponent to this I literally learned this off of like those like little junky things where there's like you'll find like a store in a outside mall where there's like just little blocks of wood with like silly sayings on them and like wire. There's one of those I had back in my hometown where it said like, make sure the current bucket holds water before you throw out the old one. And it's like a perfectly like important approach. Every single jump I've done in my career came out of like, I had enough evidence that the thing I was going into was on track to replace the thing I was leaving. There wasn't any of this like total, close my eyes, jump into leap of faith stuff. I think it's, Notch had a day job when he started Minecraft. And the Minecraft's always this kind of like slightly scary example because it's very much this also lightning strike like Flappy Bird of there's not a lot of other Notches or Minecrafts. But like even in his case, he kept a day job surprisingly long into Minecraft before it was so obviously profitable that he like kind of had to devote more of his time to it. Yeah, but yeah, that by all means, I totally encourage that. I think the wrong approach is to like get your heart set on like one concept and just gun after that one concept and then come up here and hope it works out all right. Lots of people, like when I did my 7 months of daily prototyping, were like, why don't you just pick one game and make it? And I'd be like, because I picked the wrong one. Like instead I was able to get some evidence on like lots of traffic went to these 5 ideas. Yeah, and it gives you something more validating to go off of than just your kind of own gut. Now, as always, there's exceptions to any of these stories or someone who's made that work for them. But I see lots of cases where it's kind of the opposite of in startup world. They talk about agile development or lean methodology. There's this quote from I think Reid Hoffman, LinkedIn's founder, that like you should be basically embarrassed, or what is it? If you're not embarrassed by the first release of your project, then you took too long to put it out there. And I think that that's a sane way of looking at game development anymore too, of like you should be shopping it around while it's still super rough to figure out is this even worth making less rough. I've got friends who are constantly at shows, conferences, whatever, showing their games on their laptops off on the side to people, not trying to show like a booth, not trying to do a whole thing, not trying to get press to look at it, but just showing it to more people who haven't seen it before. And what I used to misunderstand about that was I thought that they were just trying to get word out and build awareness, and there's a little bit of that. But a lot of it is that in the process of doing that, they're constantly improving it. Because every time we show our thing to somebody, we kind of wince about certain things about it. And we go back and fix those. And then we repeat that because we're kind of dug a layer deeper. And that really kind of smooths things out in a way that otherwise we just can't. But it comes through this like long, iterative, exploratory kind of process that allows us to get somewhere that we wouldn't get just by kind of doing something that from the outset seemed like a good idea.
I've seen a lot of like talks and things that about building your portfolio, right? Like, or building your portfolio, like making connections, like 2 really good ways to get into the games industry and that kind of thing. And I've seen a lot of things about building an art portfolio, but not as much about like the programming portfolio. And I know that's not your forte or anything, but I was just wondering if you had any tips on like what would be a like good routes to take in building a portfolio as a programmer.
Sure. So there's kind of 3 different, like it is contextual in which way someone's kind of go with it. If what you're trying to do with it is get a career job someplace, then like really those places like do appreciate seeing like good grades in classes that they've heard of and like projects that hold together with low level stuff. They probably want to see some like code that goes above and beyond what everybody else has done who has those requirements, but like it's much more like it's a portfolio of like, can you do the thing that we need in an entry-level software engineer or whatever. And for that matter too, some sort of project that probably demonstrates respectable documentation practices, good code commenting, good architectural planning, these kind of things that like otherwise we can kind of brush off if we're just hacking stuff. In contrast, like if you're trying to like land work as a contract game developer where you want to get money just making somebody else's game for them, like they may never look at your code. And in their case, what they really care about is like, can you get the idea that they have working at their cost? In which case, they might not even care whatever trade-offs you make to make it happen on their budget. They know that they are not hiring a full studio. In those cases, really like variety and like I've made a bunch of kinds of games. I can make kinds of games you need me to make is what they're really looking for. They didn't, like I say, may never even actually look at your code. And then the third kind is like if you're just trying to make a game to get collaborators or get stuff out there, then similarly, like there's kind of no one to impress in terms of portfolio stuff. You can kind of, besides convincing yourself you're ready for the next level, a lot of those kind of cases, it's really straight to what can you do in doing it. But for like programming portfolio, I think even when I was applying and I got a technical game design role, like they kind of didn't look at my code until it was kind of like pretty late in the interview process. And even then, it wasn't like they like read my code project stuff. They interviewed about questions they had about, you know, they test programmers on things. There's a degree to which anymore, something like a public Git repository for certain kinds of programming roles are almost certainly looked at. In which case, then, you know, you might want to show you have activity consistently, or you might want to show you have, you know, code bases of things you contributed to. Those kind of things might impress employers, help you stand out across compared to somebody else. But again, I think a lot of it, depending on the kind of role you're looking at, is being able to demonstrate you both can do the standard formalized stuff, but also have achieved some results from it. Can ideally do some other things. Tim Ford, early mentor of mine. Anymore, I think he's with Overwatch anymore. But like he used to talk about how like what he wanted to see in software engineering interviews, like besides, you know, can the answer is programming whiteboard questions or whatever, was like, have they done something in a game where when he looks at it, he's like, how did they do that? Like he does not immediately get like what the heck they did to pull that off. And like, while that's obviously kind of an elusive concept, because like lots of other smart people can have guesses of how you did a thing, it is to kind of push yourself beyond the realm of like, okay, two objects collide and then one of them disappears and there's a particle effect. I know how that works. I'm not impressed. But like if your model like morphs somehow, if there's this like weird thing happening where like the mesh ground ripples, if there's things that you're just pulling off with like line renderers that other people aren't doing, it helps stand out that like you figured some stuff out that was not just like provided to you. It wasn't part of a template, wasn't part of a framework. Related to that, I'm glad actually that I got here from sort of rambling, but also I think important in a programmer portfolio for, I'm just going to say game industry, I'm assuming programming in general, but game industry is all I'm familiar with really, is experience working on teams of people. Someone who's only ever done lone programming, I've seen portfolios where people try to put up front at the very top like their lone programming projects as if that's going to impress people more, and then they bury their team programming projects where it's like, well, but I can't take full credit for that. But it's like if you're getting hired someplace, it's to work with a team of other people. It's where you're going to have to like learn to look at code other people wrote, write code other people can read, inject functionality amidst other things in an appropriate way, and like that's team programming. There's Katie Charmona. She was a member of my first club, founder of Golden Glitch Studios. On my podcast, she talked about like people in school sometimes get frustrated about like, oh, group projects, and like life is group projects, like it's all group projects forever. So you just like, the better you can demonstrate that you can program with a team, probably the better, for people to want to hire you and trust that your code's going to work. Even if you're like a lone hacker genius who can make something happen, that might be fine for contracting work. That's probably not appropriate for like actually impressing an HR or programming interviewer person.
So this was kind of an odd, okay? Lots of people go into the industry for different reasons. I just want your thoughts on like the successes of people who go in, say, like wanting to make a certain game. Like, this is the game they want to make versus those who like just want to make games or those who make games in certain genres. Like, what do you see in the different people?
Yeah, I mean, so the vast majority, and this is again exceptions to everything involving human beings. Vast majority, it winds up being a little bit like, I think everyone who goes to get a law degree, and I'm not a lawyer, so this is me kind of like speaking in a generic layman. I watch television shows that have people with law degrees. Like everyone who gets the law degree, like thinks like they're gonna go in there and change the system. Like they're gonna fix all the wrongs and they're gonna save the environment or whatever. And then they get to it, they're like, wow, this is incredibly complicated and hard. And they start winding up kind of just where their career takes them. I think a whole bunch of people who wind up in games, like they're gunning for that, like, oh, there's this very specific, like there was this game that they loved as a kid. They want to make this change to it and do it their way. And they're going to make their version. It's going to be huge. And like, it is so much more complicated along the way as to like, that's usually not where they find themselves doing stuff. Or like at best, that's like a phase in their career. And then after that, they've got to kind of like follow along the trends of where the market goes and how the industry changes and whatever. That said, there's this kind of like semi-legendary case, and that's a bit of a pun. I guess you can't tell because I don't know where I'm going with this. But like Breath of the Wild actually had someone who worked on it that like 10 years prior had like been posting on game developer forums for like, I really am obsessed with Zelda. I have to work on Zelda. How can I go move to Japan and work on Zelda games? And people were like, get out of here, kid. That's not how it works. And like his name's in the Breath of the Wild credits. So like it happens. It's not totally unheard of, but like that's extremely unusual that happens the way that did there. And like there's still this range to it of like, if you're at a giant company, then it's harder you're trying to steer an aircraft carrier, which involves lots of arguments. Or if you're in a kind of doing your hobby project, you can do literally anything you want and no one can stop you, barring any sort of laws being violated, I guess. And then there's kind of this just smooth gradient in the middle. As to the smaller risk you're taking, the more bizarre stuff you can do. That's part of why I like hobby projects, is you can just make things that no one in the right mind would have anticipated anyone's going to like. And if they do, you can always follow it up with like a more seriously invested in attempt at it. And this is something that like I think over time come more to terms with than I did when I was newer, my first industry job or whatever, was that like we all kind of picture that like, well, if we just join the company and we just kind of work there long enough, like we'll work our way up the ranks. And I think what I eventually kind of think about it was kind of like on a Steven Spielberg movie, and I just like Jurassic Park. Maybe it's because I'm kind of a 90s kid or whatever, but like on a Steven Spielberg movie, everyone who works on Steven Spielberg's movies doesn't get to sit in Steven Spielberg's chair later. Like that's just not how hierarchy in a business works. Or like the skills that are being developed in these different spots are like kind of specialized in those tracks that they're in. And the same thing happens of like everyone who works at a big company with like a famous lead or whatever, they're not necessarily being groomed to like replace that person's spot as a creative director. If they're going to do their own thing, it's going to be going on to do their own thing. I think that ultimately like there's kind of some benefits to that. There's kind of this, it's better to be kind of your own self and explore who that is instead of like a second rate of somebody else's thing or an echo of maybe a game you were a fan of or something. I mean, again, though, I can also say, just as another example of like where it has worked out, Mark Diaz, guy came out of Full Sail, huge fan of Doom when he was younger, worked on Doom 2016, brilliant guy, really enjoyed his, like, he just seems so happy every time I talk to him, like, he worked on Doom and he loves Doom. Like, those things do happen. It is just like, I don't know. I think the other thing is to realize, too, that there's often stepping stones in the way there. And I think that this is something that in job search, when we see these things of like these very steep requirements, when we find game companies we've heard of, we look at their job requirements and it's like, X years experience and whatever. And it's like this chicken and egg problem. What really is going on is people who work at the company, it's not their first gig. Like they've already spent 2 to 3 to 5 years at other companies you haven't heard of. And that's where they've accumulated those years that qualify them to apply there. The places we have heard of. And so a lot of it becomes, okay, well, even if I want to get there, then like that might not be my first stop. That might not be my thing right out of school. What are my middle ground steps between here and there, and how do those connect me to it like a series of hops?
You say in finding ways to develop those skills, you say that as me, I don't really have like a set niche, I guess, where it's like programming or crossing or art. So the best is still kind of stay, I guess, well balanced, where I can do both, or find the niche.
So it very much depends on again, company, scale, culture, whatever. On a small team, being cross-functionally fluent is incredibly valuable. On a larger team, typically, Valve used to talk about, and they're a weird example anymore using because I've heard all kinds of problems of how their offices are run. But they used to use this example that I thought was very good at articulating it, of like a T, where there's like one skill that's super deep, and like that's the one you're actually hired for. But then like if you have a T cross-section, if you also can do some other things, that cross-functional fluency is really good for your communication. You can now better speak to other artists and other sound designers and other people. Or if you ever wind up in like a producer role where you have to be able to coordinate work with different kinds of people, it's very beneficial to not just be coming from a single discipline background of like, yeah, but at heart you're really an engineer, or at heart you're really just an artist. And I don't say just an artist in a bad way, I just mean like specifically that. Then like, it allows you to better span that world in a way both kind of respect, even if you're not in the line doing the same stuff on the trenches that they are. The other bit is that there is like, you said art and programming, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, do you know what a technical artist is?
Not a whole lot.
So a technical artist is a very specific position that is someone who is like cross-functional in, they have programming skill set and background training type of capabilities, but have gone out of their way to also have art fluency training, understanding visual aesthetics, keen eye for color, all those kind of things. And what they'll often wind up doing is like programming shaders and visual effects and all kinds of other things where like, you don't just want to take a software engineer and stick them on this fundamentally visual task. you also usually can't take someone who's like a very skilled artist but only knows art tools and have them try to do this like semi-procedural thing with code. And technical artist is like a reasonably solid paying thing. But there's a whole range of, like I say, procedural stuff, shader programming, etc. That technical artist is very much a role that might be worth looking into. Of like, it's very tightly in the Venn diagram. If you're going studio route, then I would be like, technical artist seems like it makes maybe the most sense. If you're going smaller project, small team, indie scale type stuff, then like maybe keeping both pretty functionally fluent, pretty valuable to be able to prototype things. A friend of mine from a second club, Vuha, he worked on EA Maxis anymore. He's with Phenomena, I think, with Wadham. Like, he does these like game jams and stuff where his games just like look really good because he's also an artist in addition to being a programmer, and his stuff just stands out in a way that like other people's don't because he's able to do it. And you know, bothers to like put in the time on like after he makes this like very quickly programmed game, doing his art for it. Same thing with Anthony Jones, whose primary background now is as an art instructor for concept art, but now he's also doing game programming. He's bringing his art talent to that. So even when he makes a kind of a quick VR demo, like the monsters look really, really cool in a way that helps his stuff stand out. So, you know, there's no wrong answer, but I think there is a matter of just kind of figuring out what you want out of it in terms of which one of those to emphasize or lean into. Josh Wagner, another former coworker of mine, worked at Zip Zap Play together. He was a program at the time. He was pure artist. Since then, he's picked up software engineering skills. He now kind of like functionally fills both roles at companies, and he didn't like lose his art in the process. But he just now has two sets of skills.
That's it. So, another round of applause for Chris.